April 1945. The roads of Bavaria were choked with dust, desperation, and the ghosts of a collapsing empire. The Third Reich, which had promised to last 1,000 years, was collapsing in less than 12. The Wehrmacht was in full retreat, cities were burning, and the civilian population was caught in a nightmare of their own making. Among the endless columns of German prisoners shuffling toward Allied custody was a young woman who clutched her swollen belly as if it were the only thing left worth protecting. Her name was Helga Müller, 24 years old, exhausted beyond measure, terrified beyond words. The war had taken everything from her: her husband, her home, her certainty about the future. Now, as she stood in line at the American processing camp near Regensburg, she feared it would take the one thing she had left, the life growing inside her. Helga had walked for 3 days to reach the American lines. 3 days through forests still echoing with artillery fire, past villages reduced to rubble, over roads littered with abandoned tanks and the bodies of soldiers who would never go home. She had been living in a small farming village near Nuremberg when the final offensive began. Her husband, Friedrich Bauer, had been conscripted in 1943 and sent to the Eastern Front. She received one letter from him, dated October 1944, telling her he loved her and that he would return. She never heard from him again. By the time she discovered she was pregnant, Friedrich was already dead, killed in some frozen field in Poland, buried in an unmarked grave with thousands of others. Helga carried his child alone, through the winter of 1944 and into the spring of 1945, as the world around her disintegrated. When the Americans arrived in her village, Helga faced a choice: stay and risk the chaos of occupation, or surrender herself to the Allied authorities and hope for protection. She had heard stories, terrible stories. Stories of women being separated from their children, of infants taken to orphanages, of mothers sent to labor camps while their babies disappeared into the bureaucratic machinery of post-war Europe. She did not know how much of it was true, how much was propaganda, how much was the paranoid whisper of a traumatized population. But she knew she could not risk it, so she walked. She joined the columns of refugees, displaced persons, former soldiers, and civilians fleeing the collapse. She walked until her feet bled, until her back ached, until she could barely stand. And then she arrived at the gates of the American camp near Regensburg, and she prayed that whoever processed her would see her not as an enemy, but as a mother. Sergeant James Patterson watched the line from behind a makeshift desk, his uniform dusty, his eyes weary from weeks of processing the human wreckage of a fallen regime. He had been in Europe since D-Day, landing on Omaha Beach in June 1944, fighting through France, Belgium, and finally into Germany itself. He had seen combat, seen death, seen things he would never speak about to anyone, not even his wife. But the war was over now, or nearly so, and his job had changed from killing Germans to managing them. He processed thousands of prisoners in the past weeks, men, women, elderly, young, all of them hollow-eyed, all of them carrying invisible wounds. He had become numb to it, developing the emotional armor necessary to function in such circumstances. But when Helga stepped forward, something in her expression stopped him cold. It was not just fear. It was the terror of a mother who believed her child was about to be ripped away. She stood before his desk, trembling, her hands instinctively cradling her belly. Her clothes were torn and dirty, her face gaunt from malnutrition, her eyes red from sleepless nights. She tried to speak, but her voice caught in her throat. Jim looked down at the processing form in front of him, then back at her. He had been doing this job for weeks, and he had developed a routine: name, age, place of origin, occupation, political affiliation. Check for SS tattoos, check for party membership, stamp the form, send them through. But looking at Helga, he could not bring himself to follow the routine. She spoke no English. He spoke no German. But when she placed both hands on her belly and looked at him with eyes that pleaded without sound, he understood everything. He had a wife back home in Pennsylvania, Margaret. They had been married for 6 years, and she was waiting for him to return so they could start a family. He thought of Margaret every day, imagined what it would be like to see her pregnant, to hold his own child. And looking at Helga, he saw not an enemy, but a woman who could have been his wife in different circumstances. Jim glanced at the camp commander's tent, then back at Helga. He made a decision that would echo across decades. He wrote something on her processing card, stamped it with more force than necessary, and said in a voice firm enough to carry authority but soft enough to carry kindness, "Keep your baby with you." Helga did not understand the words, but she understood the gesture. He pointed to her belly, then to the medical tent on the far side of the compound, then nodded slowly. She would not be separated. Not today. Not under his watch. Helga's eyes filled with tears. She reached across the desk as if to touch his hand, then pulled back, uncertain if such a gesture would be allowed. Jim nodded again, this time with a faint smile, and motioned for her to move to the medical tent. As she walked away, he watched her go, wondering if he had just broken some regulation, wondering if his commanding officer would question his decision, wondering if it even mattered. The war was over. It was time to start acting like human beings again. Inside the medical tent, Dr. Elizabeth Hartmann, a German-American physician working with the Allied relief effort, examined Helga with practiced efficiency. The conditions were far from ideal. Cots lined the tent in tight rows. Supplies were rationed and often inadequate, and the air smelled of antiseptic, sweat, and exhaustion. But Dr. Hartmann had seen worse, much worse. She had worked in field hospitals during the war's final months, delivering babies under bombardment, stitching wounds by candlelight, performing surgeries without anesthesia. She had seen women give birth in basements while buildings collapsed around them, had seen infants born into a world that seemed determined to destroy them before they took their first breath. Now, in the strange and chaotic peace that followed Germany's surrender, she continued her work with quiet determination. Helga was malnourished, dehydrated, and due to give birth within weeks, possibly sooner. Dr. Hartmann made notes on a clipboard, prescribed extra rations from the limited supplies available, and assured Helga through a translator, a young German woman named Greta, who had been hired by the Americans, that she would be cared for, that her baby would stay with her, that she was safe now. Helga wept, not from pain, but from relief so profound it felt like a physical weight lifting from her chest. She had been carrying the fear for so long, the constant terror that her child would be taken, that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to breathe without that crushing anxiety. Dr. Hartmann placed a hand on her shoulder, a gesture of comfort that transcended language and nationality. She had delivered dozens of babies in the camp already, and she would deliver dozens more in the months to come. Each one was a small victory, a tiny act of defiance against the machinery of death that had dominated Europe for 6 years. Each cry of a newborn was a promise that life would continue, that the world would rebuild, that there was still hope. Captain William Hayes, the camp commander, was a man of discipline and protocol. He had been a soldier for 20 years, rising through the ranks through competence, dedication, and an unwavering belief in the importance of order. He had served in World War I as a young lieutenant, seen the trenches, seen the gas attacks, seen the senseless slaughter that had defined that conflict. He had hoped never to see war again, but when Hitler invaded Poland, he knew his duty. He had commanded men in North Africa, in Italy, and finally in Germany itself. He believed in rules, in the chain of command, in the necessity of military discipline. But he was also a father. He had 3 children back home in Ohio, 2 daughters and a son, and the thought of them being torn from their mother was unbearable. His wife, Dorothy, wrote to him every week, telling him about their lives, about how the children were growing, about how they prayed for his safe return. He carried those letters with him everywhere, reading them over and over until the paper was soft and creased. When Sergeant Patterson brought Helga's case to his attention, along with reports of several other pregnant women in the camp, Captain Hayes listened without interruption. He sat behind his desk in the command tent, a map of occupied Germany spread out before him, and he considered the situation carefully. Resources were scarce. The camp was overcrowded. There were logistical challenges, security concerns, and 1,000 other problems demanding his attention. But as Patterson spoke, as he described the terror in Helga's eyes, the desperation of the other women, Captain Hayes thought of his own daughters. He thought of Dorothy. He thought of the world his children would inherit, and he made a decision. He authorized additional medical resources for pregnant women in the camp. He issued orders that mothers and infants were not to be separated unless absolutely necessary. He cited the Geneva Conventions, humanitarian principles that were still being formalized in the aftermath of the war, but that he believed should guide their actions regardless of legal technicalities. Some of his fellow officers questioned the decision. Resources were scarce, they argued. The priority should be maintaining order, processing prisoners efficiently, not playing nursemaid to enemy civilians. But Captain Hayes was unmoved. "We are not monsters," he said quietly. We will not become what we fought against. If we lose our humanity in victory, then what exactly did we win? In the weeks that followed, Helga's belly grew, and so did the number of women like her in the camp. Anna Zimmermann arrived in early May, just days after Germany's unconditional surrender. She was 21 years old, pregnant and alone. She had been a forced laborer in a munitions factory near Stuttgart, taken from her home in 1943, and put to work assembling artillery shells for 12 hours a day. Her child's father was a man she had never loved, a factory foreman who had taken what he wanted and left her with nothing but shame and a life growing inside her. Anna had tried to hide her pregnancy for as long as possible, terrified of what would happen if the factory administrators discovered her condition. But eventually, it became impossible to conceal, and she was dismissed, left to wander the roads with thousands of other displaced persons until she found her way to the American camp. Anna and Helga became friends, sharing a tent, sharing stories, sharing the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, they would survive this. They talked late into the night, whispering in the darkness, comparing their fears and their dreams. Anna had no idea what she would do after the baby was born. She had no family left, no home to return to. Helga promised to help her, to stay with her, to make sure she was not alone. They became sisters in suffering, bound together by circumstances neither had chosen, but both had to endure. Dr. Hartman checked on them daily, monitoring their health, advocating for better food, cleaner water, safer conditions. She argued with supply officers, negotiated with military administrators, and used every ounce of her authority and persuasion to ensure that the pregnant women under her care received what they needed. She was a bridge between two worlds, fluent in both English and German, understanding both American military culture and German civilian desperation. She had left Germany in 1938, seeing the writing on the wall, and had built a new life in America. But she had never forgotten where she came from, and now she used her position to help women who could have been her sisters, her cousins, her friends. She delivered babies in conditions that would have horrified any peacetime hospital, but she did it with skill and compassion, treating each mother and child as if they were the most important people in the world. On June 12, 1945, Helga went into labor. It started in the early morning, a dull ache in her lower back that gradually intensified into waves of pain that took her breath away. Anna ran to fetch Dr. Hartman, who arrived within minutes, her medical bag in hand, her expression calm and focused. The labor was long and difficult. Helga was weak from months of malnutrition, and her body struggled with the demands being placed on it. Dr. Hartman stayed with her throughout, monitoring her progress, offering encouragement, doing everything possible to ensure both mother and child survived. Outside the tent, Sergeant Patterson paced back and forth, unable to focus on his duties, thinking about the young woman he had processed weeks earlier. He had checked on her several times since then, bringing extra food when he could, asking Dr. Hartman about her condition. He felt a strange sense of responsibility for her, as if by stamping her processing card he had made a promise he needed to keep. When the baby's first cry pierced the air, sharp and strong and unmistakably alive, Jim felt something break open inside him. He stopped pacing, closed his eyes, and allowed himself a moment of gratitude. He thought of his own wife back home, of the letters she sent him, of the life they would build when this was all over. He thought of the world his children would inherit, and he prayed it would be better than this. Inside the tent, Helga held her son for the first time, feeling his warmth against her chest, his tiny heartbeat fluttering like a bird's wings, his perfect miniature fingers curling instinctively around hers. She named him Klaus. Klaus Bauer, after her late husband, a man who had died on the Eastern Front and who would never meet his son, never hold him, never see the miracle they had created together. She whispered promises to Klaus in the dim light of the medical tent, that she would protect him, that she would tell him every day he was loved, that she would never, ever let him go. Dr. Hartman cleaned the baby, checked his vital signs, and wrapped him in a clean blanket, one of the few luxuries available in the camp. She placed Klaus in Helga's arms and smiled. "He is strong," she said in German. "He will survive. You both will." The camp slowly emptied over the summer of 1945. Prisoners were released, displaced persons were relocated to temporary housing, and the massive machinery of post-war reconstruction ground slowly forward. Helga and Klaus were eventually transferred to a resettlement camp near Munich, a sprawling complex of temporary barracks, where thousands of Germans waited to be processed, to find housing, to begin the impossible task of rebuilding their lives. Helga found work cleaning rubble from bombed-out buildings, joining the thousands of women who formed the backbone of Germany's reconstruction. They were called Trümmerfrauen, rubble women, and they worked from dawn to dusk, moving bricks, clearing debris, salvaging anything that could be reused. It was backbreaking labor, but it was honest, and it allowed Helga to keep Klaus with her. She carried him on her back in a makeshift sling, and he grew strong despite the hardships, despite the scarcity of food, despite the uncertainty of their future. Helga never forgot the American sergeant who had stamped her processing card, who had looked at her with compassion instead of contempt. She never forgot Dr. Hartmann, who had delivered Klaus and saved both their lives. She never forgot Captain Hayes, whose orders had made it all possible. But she also knew she would never see them again. They were part of a chapter that was closing, a war that was ending, a history that was being written in blood and ash, and the faint, stubborn hope of survival. She kept the processing card, folded carefully and stored in a small wooden box along with Friedrich's last letter and a photograph of their wedding day. She told herself that one day, when Klaus was old enough to understand, she would show him these things and explain where he came from. But as the years passed, she found it harder and harder to speak about those days. The memories were too painful, the emotions too raw. She wanted to protect Klaus from the weight of that history, to give him a childhood unburdened by the trauma she had endured. Years passed. Klaus grew up in a Germany that was rebuilding itself from ruins, transforming from a devastated wasteland into an economic powerhouse. He attended school, made friends, and lived a life that seemed normal on the surface. But he always sensed there was something his mother was not telling him, some shadow from the past that she kept carefully hidden. His mother told him stories, but never the full truth. She told him he was born in difficult times, that good people had helped them, that he should be grateful for life, but she never told him about the camp, about the fear, about the sergeant who had saved them. She wanted to protect him from the weight of that history, to let him grow up without the burden of knowing how close he had come to never existing at all. Klaus was a curious child, always asking questions, always wanting to understand how things worked and why things were the way they were. As he grew into a thoughtful teenager, his questions became more pointed. Where was I born? Who helped us? Why won't you talk about the war? Helga deflected, changed the subject, offered partial truths that satisfied him for a while, but never completely. By the time Klaus was in his 20s, he had become obsessed with understanding where he came from. He studied history, read everything he could find about the end of the war, about the displaced persons camps, about the humanitarian efforts of the Allied forces. He asked his mother questions she would not answer, and her silence only fueled his determination. He searched through old documents, faded photographs, records that had survived the war. He found his birth certificate, issued by the American military government, stamped with the name of a processing camp near Regensburg. He found his mother's processing card, carefully preserved in her wooden box, with a signature he could not read and a stamp that said, "Special Humanitarian Consideration." He stared at those words for a long time, wondering what they meant, wondering who had written them, wondering if that person knew they had saved his life. By the time Klaus was 40 years old, his mother had passed away. She died peacefully, in her sleep, in the small apartment in Munich where she had raised him. It was 1985, 40 years after the end of the war, and Helga had lived to see Germany reunified in spirit, if not yet in fact, had seen her son grow into a successful man, had seen the world rebuild itself from the ashes. But before she died, in her final weeks when she knew her time was short, she gave Klaus a box. Inside were letters, photographs, and a name: Sergeant James Patterson, Regensburg Processing Camp, June 1945. She told him, in a voice weak but clear, that this man had saved them, that without him Klaus would never have been born, or would have been taken from her, lost in the chaos of post-war Europe. She told him to find this man if he could, to thank him, to let him know that his kindness had mattered. Klaus held his mother's hand as she spoke, tears streaming down his face, and he promised her he would find Sergeant Patterson. He would close the circle that had been left open for 4 decades. The search took months. Klaus contacted veterans organizations in the United States, wrote letters to military archives, reached out to historical societies dedicated to preserving the memory of World War II. He placed advertisements in newspapers, contacted television programs that specialized in reuniting people separated by the war. He traveled to the United States, visiting the National Archives in Washington, speaking with researchers and historians, following every lead, no matter how tenuous. Many of the people he contacted were skeptical. 40 years was a long time. Records were incomplete. Many veterans had passed away, but Klaus was relentless. He had made a promise to his mother, and he would not give up. Finally, in the spring of 1985, he received a reply. A researcher at a veterans organization in Pennsylvania had found a James Patterson who had served in the unit responsible for the Regensburg camp. The researcher provided an address, a phone number, and a note saying that Mr. Patterson was alive and living in a small town outside Pittsburgh. Klaus's hands shook as he dialed the number. The phone rang 3 times before a woman answered. Margaret Patterson. Klaus introduced himself, explained who he was and why he was calling. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and for a moment Klaus feared he had made a mistake, that this was the wrong James Patterson, that his search had led nowhere. But then Margaret's voice came back, thick with emotion. "Oh my God," she said. "Jim told me about you, about your mother. He has talked about that day for 40 years. Klaus felt his throat tighten. He asked if he could visit, if he could meet Sergeant Patterson in person. Margaret did not hesitate. "Yes," she said. "Please come. He will want to see you." Klaus booked a flight to Pittsburgh, his heart pounding with anticipation and nervousness. He had spent so long searching, and now he was about to meet the man who had saved his life before he was even born. When Klaus knocked on the door of the small house in Pennsylvania, James Patterson opened it and saw a man who looked nothing like the infant he had helped save, but everything like the future he had hoped for. Jim was 70 years old now. His hair white, his face lined with age, but his eyes were still sharp and kind. They stood there for a moment. 2 strangers connected by an act of kindness, 40 years old, separated by language and culture, and an ocean, but bound together by a single decision made in the chaos of 1945. Then Klaus extended his hand and said in careful English, "You told my mother to keep me. Thank you." Jim took his hand, and then, without thinking, pulled him into an embrace. He had wondered for 40 years what had happened to Helga and her baby. He had hoped they survived, but he had never known for sure. And now here was Klaus, alive, healthy, standing in his doorway. Margaret stood behind Jim, tears streaming down her face. She had heard the stories. She had read the letters Jim had written home from Germany, letters in which he described the pregnant woman he had processed, the fear in her eyes, the decision he had made. But she had never imagined this moment would come. They sat together for hours in the Pattersons' living room, surrounded by photographs of Jim and Margaret's children and grandchildren. Klaus told Jim about his mother, about her strength, about the life she had built from nothing. He described how she had worked as a Trümmerfrau, how she had raised him alone, how she had never remarried, dedicating her life to ensuring he had opportunities she never had. Jim told Klaus about the camp, about Dr. Hartman and her tireless efforts to care for the pregnant women, about Captain Hayes and his decision to prioritize humanitarian principles over bureaucratic efficiency. He told Klaus about the thousands of women and children they had tried to protect, about the chaos of those final months, about the strange mixture of relief and exhaustion that came with the war's end. They talked about the war, about the peace, about the strange and fragile threads that connect human lives across time and distance. Jim showed Klaus the letters he had kept, yellowed with age, in which he had written to Margaret about the things he was seeing, the decisions he was making, the hope that somehow it would all mean something. Klaus showed Jim the processing card, the birth certificate, the photograph of his mother holding him as a newborn. Jim stared at the photograph for a long time, his eyes misting with tears. "I remember that day," he said quietly. "I remember waiting outside the tent, hearing the baby cry, feeling like maybe we had done something right in the middle of all that madness." Before Klaus left, Jim gave him something. He went upstairs to his study and returned with a small wooden box, similar to the one Helga had kept. Inside was a photograph. It was faded, creased, but unmistakable. It showed a young sergeant in an American uniform standing outside a medical tent, and in the background, barely visible but definitely there, a woman holding a newborn baby. Helga and Klaus, June 1945. Jim had kept it all these years, not knowing if he would ever see them again, but hoping that somewhere they were alive. They were safe. They were free. Klaus held the photograph with trembling hands. "This is us," he whispered. "This is the moment." Jim nodded. "I took that picture the day after Klaus was born," he said. "I wanted to remember. I wanted proof that something good had come out of all the death and destruction." Klaus carefully placed the photograph in his bag, knowing it would become one of his most treasured possessions. Klaus returned to Germany with the photograph, with the stories, with the closure he had been seeking his entire life. He wrote a book about his mother, about the war children born in the final months and immediate aftermath of World War II, about the soldiers and doctors and commanders who had chosen humanity over hatred. He interviewed other war children, collected their stories, documented the humanitarian efforts that had saved thousands of lives. He dedicated the book to Sergeant James Patterson, Dr. Elizabeth Hartman, and Captain William Hayes. 3 names among millions, but 3 names that had made all the difference. The book was published in 1987 and became a bestseller in Germany, sparking a broader conversation about the human cost of war and the importance of compassion, even in the darkest times. Jim lived another 10 years, long enough to see Klaus's book published, long enough to read the German edition with the help of a translator, long enough to know that his decision in 1945 had mattered more than he could have imagined. He received letters from other war children, from people who had been saved by similar acts of kindness, from veterans who remembered making the same kinds of decisions. He was invited to speak at schools, at veterans events, at historical conferences. He always said the same thing: "I was just doing what any decent person would do. I saw a mother and I helped her. That is all." But everyone who heard him knew it was more than that. In a world consumed by hatred and violence, he had chosen compassion, and that choice had echoed across 4 decades, creating ripples that touched countless lives. When Jim died in 1995, Klaus traveled to Pennsylvania for the funeral. He stood beside Margaret, beside Jim and Margaret's children and grandchildren, and he spoke about a day in June 1945, when a tired sergeant had looked at a terrified mother and said 5 words that would echo across a lifetime: "Keep your baby with you." He spoke about how those words had given his mother hope, had allowed him to be born, had set in motion a chain of events that led to this moment. He thanked the Patterson family for sharing Jim with the world, for supporting him in his work, for raising a man who believed that kindness mattered even when the world was falling apart. After the funeral, Margaret gave Klaus Jim's medals, his service ribbons, and the letters he had written from Germany. "These belong with you," she said. "You are part of his legacy." Klaus accepted them with gratitude, knowing that he would treasure them for the rest of his life. The story of Helga, Klaus, and Jim is not unique. There were thousands of women like Helga, pregnant and terrified, caught in the machinery of war. There were thousands of soldiers like Jim, ordinary men faced with extraordinary choices, who decided to act with compassion instead of cruelty. There were thousands of children like Klaus, born into chaos, saved by the kindness of strangers who grew up to live full and meaningful lives. But each story is singular. Each act of compassion is irreplaceable. Each life saved is a universe preserved. In the chaos of war, in the machinery of destruction, in the vast and impersonal forces of history, there are moments when a single human being makes a choice: to see another person not as an enemy, but as a mother, not as a prisoner, but as a human being, not as a number, but as a life worth saving. Those moments do not end wars. They do not rewrite history. They do not change the course of nations. But they do something more important. They prove that even in the darkest times, even when the world is burning, even when everything seems lost, there is still room for kindness. There is still space for mercy. There is still hope. And sometimes, 40 years later, that hope knocks on your door and says thank you. If you found this story moving, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments below. History is not just about the great battles and famous leaders. It is about the small moments, the quiet heroes, and the lives that continue because someone chose compassion over cruelty. Thank you for watching.